Right. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, I guess, the 12th of this series of webinars, seminars on the future of cybersecurity. So today's session is on ethics on cybersecurity, and we have a packed program, four speakers coming up this afternoon. Before we kick off with the welcomes from SCCS and from SASIG, I just have a few housekeeping notes. So first of all, just remind people to mute their devices so we don't get beeps going off during the talks. Be aware, those in the room, be aware that the microphones and speakers are in the ceiling above you. They're very sensitive, so anything that you whisper to your neighbour may well be picked up on the recording, so be aware of that. Fire exits are at the back. We're not expecting any fire alarms, so if it goes off, then we should use those. Bathrooms are through in the atrium, the foyer area behind me, and if you've driven and you're parking, then you need to scan the QR code to make sure that you're on the system. So without further ado, I'll invite Joanna. I'm pleased to welcome you, Joanna Buriani, Director of SCCS. Who will give a welcome from Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity.
Right. Okay, so as you see in this banner, there's a presence from the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity. It was on our first slide. So Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity was started many years ago. I don't even know how many, but probably more like, not in this format, but more like 20 years ago. So someone told me that Steve was at the center for 20 years today. But now I'm going to present you what we do presently. So what we have got at this point in time is to be a research center, basically recognized by GCHQ, have been recognized by GCHQ, or rather part of GCHQ, that's called the National Centre for Cybersecurity, together with other bodies, funding bodies in the UK, such as EPSRC, to be a centre of excellence in research in the UK. So we're not the only ones. We're about 20 or so of these at the moment. It started as a small club. It keeps growing. We're one of them. And we have about 50 researchers inside, and we work on different topics on cybersecurity. And we're also interested not just in research, but also in outreach, such as today when we're doing an event like this one. And we also have an education accreditation, as per written in here, in cybersecurity education excellence. So we are a big part of the Department of Computer Science, and we are doing all sorts of events linked to cybersecurity. We were even awarded Cyber University of the Year in 2023. It was a venture between us as a center and the IT department at University of Surrey. So we are not, as it were, standalone. We work with other bodies, and we're part of other bodies, or even we lead other bodies in the UK in cybersecurity. So there are research institutes, such as the first one in here, that is called VETS, that is co-led out of our SCCS. This is a research center in verified trustworthy software, and is one of the 4 that the UK has in cybersecurity. So it's really important that we are part of this. A different type of, I won't go through all of them, but a different type of affiliation is with UKC3. So UKC3 is a body in the UK that links academia, businesses, and councils to produce outreach and encourage economic growth. And our center, this research center that I'm speaking about, is also the foundation of a cluster that is a UKCT cluster and is, as I say, promoting growth in the region of Surrey. And other bodies, some of which are international, such as this one in here, that is across different countries, that looks at, for instance, security with respect to data and AI. Others are more educational, creating body of knowledge, and so on. So I won't go through all of this, but it's just to say that this is a very active national and international research center that is, together with SASIC, facilitating this today. If you are interested in particular topics of security, for those of you that are more technically minded, we work on these topics, roughly speaking, in here. So on mathematics, called cryptography of security, of underpinning security, but also on applications or more applicative aspects, such as software and verification or distributed systems and so on. So today we're going to hear about ethics, and ethics can go through all of these 5 themes, which are very, very deeply covered and broadly covered in SCCS. Just to give you an idea, we about 22 permanent members of staff in SCCS, and on my first slide we said we're about 15 in total in SCCS, probably a bit more than 50 now. I won't go into the details of the slides, but what you're supposed to get from this is that if you were to look at the titles of things that appear on the slide, you will see that we are active in research projects across the piece. And we also get a lot of funding from different funding bodies to do research in collaboration with academia and other universities in Europe and in the UK. Be it in hardware, for instance, like this one in here would be in hardware, this one would be on digital economy, this one in here would, or let's say this one in here would be on software and so on. And that is the end of my overview for the research part of it. And I said that as there's also, with a very similar name, a cluster. So I intentionally did not use the abbreviations because even I will get confused of how similar these abbreviations are. So there's the research center that I spoke about at Oxford University, and there is a different endeavor, which is the cluster, the UKC3 cluster. This is the slides that follow are about this other endeavor that is the cluster. And the cluster, like SASIC, like the research group that I've spoken about, tries to enhance the area of security in the county of Surrey. So it's called Surrey Cybersecurity Cluster, and I'm an advisory for this cluster. So this cluster is recognized by what I said earlier to be an entire body in the UK called UKC3, and is a partnership between all these organizations here. So 2 universities, University of Surrey, Royal Holloway, and some important companies in the area, BAE Systems. There should be also ACMA in here. It's not Active Learning, Login Lounge, and so on. So these are companies in the area that want to grow cybersecurity as a topic in the wide sense of it. So if you are interested to go to the website of the cluster, you would see who is involved in this cluster. And what is interesting is that University of Surrey and University of Royal Holloway, together with the council, really were at the foundation steps of this endeavor. And they create events similar to this one. And of course, we're not competing. So what we want to say is that they are trying to reach out as well through similar events. They have events that they call red team event, white team event, and purple team event. So technical event, business-like event, and somewhere in the middle like events. And they run them, when I say they, I just mean the cluster, across every month in primarily in a place in Camberley called the Login Lounge. And this is the statistics of what they've been doing since 2022, more or less. I won't go through every single event in here, no way. But what you will see is, for instance, in the red team event since 2022, 2021, you will see that they, like we have today, ethics and security, they have different topics. So every event has a topic. So one of them may be on vulnerabilities, on banking, another one maybe on quantum challenges and so on. So if you are interested in this, you can also look up this organization and see. And in the future, we might look to have some of these events collocated. There are events that are more business oriented, the so-called white team events, and events that are sort of about defense and cybersecurity awareness. Also, the council is very much involved in this. The council is the foundation body inside the cluster, and they run events that are more focused on social aspects. So trying to, for instance, teach young students about security, or teach some parents about how to navigate things online. They have a program called Inspire Sari, and they work through the cluster to navigate this space. Finally, in the future, the cluster, in the very near future, would launch something called the Cybersecurity Escape Room. So this is a gamified environment where people can go and do cybersecurity awareness training. It will be a sort of paid program where anyone who wants to do cybersecurity awareness training, from a small to a big company, could do it through this program that the cluster has been developed. And I say watch this space, because in the future we'll release more about this. I don't want to take more of your time. If you want to go to this website, hopefully my slides will be available. You'll find more about the cluster, or you can go on LinkedIn and other such platforms, and you'll find more about the cluster. And if you want to know more about the research center, then again, go back to the slides and reach out to me or to Steve, and we will tell you more about it. This is all from me on the research center and the cluster.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So now we have a welcome from Danny King online. So Managing Director of SASIG, and he will say a few words from SASIG.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining everybody today. For those that are new to SASIG, the Security Awareness Special Interest Group is a free networking forum for cybersecurity professionals. So we aim to provide a subscription-free thought leadership forum, and over the last 20 years we've become the leading networking community for cybersecurity professionals through our regular masterclasses and networking sessions. So we're rapidly growing during that time. I'm delighted to say that we now have over 11,000 members, those representing over 4,000 organisations from across the UK and around the world. And as Steve said earlier, today's the 12th event that we've collaborated with the Surrey Centre. And my many thanks goes out to everybody at the Surrey Institute for working with us on this ongoing series, and as well to our thought leaders who will be sharing their knowledge with us today. So that's Professor Alan Woodward, Javid Malik, from one of our supporters, KnowBe4, Dr. Isan Torini, and John Chapman. So please see today's event over at the sasig.com for links to connect with them on LinkedIn. And also to say that we are also extremely grateful for all of SASIG supporters, whom we simply wouldn't be able to do all that we do without them. Next slide, please. Now, SASIG produces daily webinars throughout the year, looking at a whole variety of different subject matters. And here's just a selection of some of those that are coming up over the next few days. So tomorrow at 11, we have the ultimate people-centric guide to simulated phishing, where we explore metrics, limitations, and how to run phishing campaigns that reveal what's driving user risk. On Friday, we consider how we might combat AI-driven cyber threats by educating your team on the dangers and how data breaches are helping evolve AI. And next Monday, we unveil the dark side of the evolution of artificial learning and machine learning in cyber threats and malicious actors, and look to understand AI's increasing impact on the cyber landscape and how it impacts the way that we must defend ourselves going forward. And on Tuesday, we have the cyber simulation workshop, where in a good old-fashioned choose your own adventure style, we'll be making key decisions in a simulated attack based on real adversaries causing major disruption, and we find out how our collective actions shape recovery efforts. So those are our webinars coming up over the next few days. SASIG also offers over 20 in-person events every year as well, twice a month in London and around the UK. And next month we have our members-only Christmas luncheon, so we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary, and there's still time to apply online to make our 5 new friends. And we just announced for the new year our insightful event on securing the future of data, navigating AI, sovereignty and cyber threats as well. And in that, we'll discover how effective data management goes beyond security to drive success and collaboration. We'll explore strategies to harness data for competitive advantage while fostering shared solutions for a safer, more prosperous future. And we'll be announcing more events soon over on thesasig.com/events for more topics and locations. Next slide, please. And just before I hand back to cover quickly a few house rules. So the Chatham House rule is in effect today, so please do respect our speakers, our questioners, and other attendees, and we ask you not to attribute what has been said today back to them whilst we're learning. Today's is about learning, so we do encourage everybody, both in Surrey and online, to ask questions. And we also welcome your feedback, and there'll be a QR code on screen at the end today. So please scan that and let us know what you thought of today. It's only by you letting us know what we've liked and that we continue to offer it. And if you fancy taking to the stage yourself, please do drop us an email at info@thesasig.com. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and share SASIG with your colleagues too. Thesasig.com is where all of that is at. So other than that, enjoy the fantastic presentations that we have coming up, and back to you all in Guildford. Thank you.
The programme of talks, and our first talk will be delivered online over Zoom, and that will be coming from Professor Alan Woodward, who is one of our professors at the University of Surrey, at SCCS. So we're just getting the technology in place. I can see Alan there on the screen. So I think we're... This is looking promising. Alan, are you able to share your screen?
Is that working?
Yes, that's looking good.
Oh,
Yep,
good.
we've got that on the screen here. So I will hand over to Alan. So over to you.
Right. Well, I wasn't entirely sure of sort of the how technical some of the audience would be, and I'm pretty useless at putting formulas into slides anyway. So what I wanted to try and do was address this whole point about ethics from a very specific example, and it's one that I think most of you will have. It might sound very old hat indeed, but most of you will have come across, even discussed it. And to show just how old the question is, I actually wrote most of this that you're about to see about 10 years ago when I was advising Europol. And it's about privacy. You would think that cybersecurity, one of its main, if any lecture on cybersecurity, we always talk about the triad CIA, confidentiality and integrity and authenticity. The confidentiality, protecting privacy is one of the big things that cybersecurity is supposed to do. But there is a bit of a dilemma when you actually think about it. So let's think about it. What is privacy? Well, privacy is actually quite difficult to define in many ways. It's certainly quite difficult to quantify, but it's really the rights of individuals to control their own information, their own personal information, and to decide, A, how it's collected, how it's used, how it's shared, and to what degree it's protected. I imagine most people will be fed up with how much information is actually collected on them. There's whole ethical issues there. But if you start to think about privacy in terms of going back to the individual's ability to control this, and it's about the ability to keep certain aspects of your life, your thoughts, your actions, as well as your personal information, private by its nature, as in confidential, or share it, but only with those that you want to share it with. Now, in a digital information-focused context, that includes, obviously personal data, like name, address, etc., things we're all used to, but also your online activities, where you're visiting, and very particularly communications, which is what we're going to just use as the example today. I mean, why is it important? Why should I be bothered about my privacy? Well, it underlies nearly all personal freedoms. I'm no philosopher. I'm a very old engineer, but when you talk to any of the sort of professional philosophers, if you like, one of the things that is essential to preserve your personal autonomy and the freedoms that we all have is this ability to keep your information private. Now, it obviously reduces security risks as well. It builds trust within the organizations. And there's a sort of slightly fluffy one, which is more about human dignity, because it's about if the individual controls their information, then it allows them to maintain a degree of dignity, which if everything about you could be known by somebody that wanted to, then your ability to maintain that dignity is actually undermined in quite a significant way. Now, in cybersecurity, as I said, we have an obligation in some ways. I mean, through the policies and practices I'm sure many of you are putting in place, the organizations put in place to limit data collection, to secure that sensitive information, and most particularly is to give the users control over their data. Since the beginning of the internet, and indeed before that, having that control over your data has been a constant dilemma, because what underlies it all, and one of the key technologies that enables all of this privacy to be maintained, is encryption. And I'll use a very particular example, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is the use of end-to-end encryption, where only the sender and the recipient are able to read the message content, and try and demonstrate why this, as an ethical consideration, isn't as simple as you might first think. You would think it would just be a bit of a no-brainer. If we're going to maintain privacy, then end-to-end encryption is something that everybody should have access to if they want it. So let's start by thinking about simple communication flows between Alice and Bob, good old Alice and Bob, and they don't want Eve to be able to eavesdrop. Now, there's only really four basic ways, four types of attack, if you like. There's the obvious one, interception, where confidentiality is not maintained. It could potentially be intercepted and sent on. Modification. You could have Eve potentially masquerading as Alice. And then there's the obvious one of just preventing the communication in the first place. And interestingly, most modern encryption schemes go back to that maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. So not only is it kept confidential, but you know that it's not been modified en route, and you know that you can be confident that it is Alice that's actually talking to you. So we've known, I mean, this is not rocket science. This is something that everybody learns first year of study in something like cybersecurity. But criminals have changed also. And one of the things that criminals have been enabled to do is to get a sort of a force multiplier out of their ability to communicate globally and securely. I mean, when I first started out in security, we were defending against fairly narrow band threats. You would have people, war dialing. They were trying to get into individual modems. You had the teams of people that were doing it were not teams at all. They were actually individuals. And when things actually went wrong and the adversary got through, most of the impact was really more about inconvenience. But as we have become more and more interconnected, I hesitate to use the word, but we are hyper-connected these days. It means that the criminals are also hyper-connected, and it gives them an opportunity as well to work together, sometimes not even in the same country. They often, and I was always very surprised about this when we first started getting information into Europol, was that often they'd never even met. They don't know who they are. And so we used to publish a document annually, still do actually, called the Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment, very snappy title. And it suggests people who know each other all collaborating. But sometimes those gangs, those organized crime gangs, they've never met. They're in totally different countries. But equally, instead of just causing inconvenience, if they do break into networks, there's some kind of network penetration, or they've managed to steal data, the cost of that failure can be extremely high. And you only have to look at the headlines every couple of weeks. And unfortunately, that's becoming increasingly true. And increasingly true, I was just doing an interview today about what would happen if the electronic payment system went down. Because people like governments in Sweden today have just advised their citizens to keep some cash in their wallet. So that the cost of failure, the cost of some of these failures could be absolutely enormous in terms of if only in terms of the disruption that it causes. So what's the issue then? Well, since the beginning of cyber attacks, the way which it's changed. They can not only cooperate, but they can communicate globally. And as I said, you get this sort of force multiplier coming in. And if it's kind of axiomatic, I guess, that if those criminals have a means of communicating, which law enforcement agencies can't understand, they can't penetrate, then it's going to be an impediment both to detection and to investigation. Even if they've managed to detect the crime, trying to find out who did it and pursue them is actually going to be extremely difficult, And something like 70% of investigations, they say, according to the data we collected anyway, are impeded because encryption is involved somehow and they can't get hold of the information they would like to complete the investigation. So encryption, where it's of the nature I said earlier, it's all under the control of the individuals. It allows them to truly maintain their privacy. It's actually seen as rather bad for agencies that are trying to, in their minds, they're trying to protect citizens from harm. So they actually see encryption that's not under their control or not something they can penetrate as being, an extremely bad idea. But people say, well, you get the privacy absolutists who say, well, it's a human right, and it is actually a human right. Formally is a human right, privacy. Article 12, the UN Declaration on Human Rights. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, etc., etc. The thing I draw your attention to there is the word arbitrary, because even when this was being drafted, people were wondering, well, there are occasions when law enforcement agencies may need to interfere with that privacy. And going all the way back to someone like David Cameron, which is actually probably one of the best quotes. He was Prime Minister at the time. If you ask the reasonable, the man on the Clapham omnibus, a reasonable person, would they endorse the fact that communication between two people cannot be read, even with a signed warrant, and it effectively, I think the phrase he used was, it gave criminals a safe place to hide? Then the answer is no, we don't want that. We mustn't have that. And that the first duty of any government was to keep its country and people safe. And they can't do that, is the argument, if you allow encryption to be solely under the control of the individuals that are using it. But it's actually, as ever, that sort of populist political statement, which has become increasingly used, we must prevent harm, over the last few years, and has led to all sorts of legislation, such as the Online Safety Bill. Let's suppose we agreed with that. Let's suppose we agreed that the encryption should not prevent the detection and the investigation of crimes, and should be able to help keep people safe. How would you make that happen? Well, as ever, there's always, the devil is in the detail. You could potentially just outlaw encryption, but practically speaking, governments no longer control this technology. I'll give you a very good example. This shows how old I am, but PGP, pretty good privacy. I'm sure most people will have used that in some form. When it was first designed in the United States, the government said, no, this could be classed as a munition. This could be used as a weapon of war. Therefore, it cannot be exported. But the Americans also have a freedom of speech clause in their constitution. So all that happened was that it was printed out, it was taken across the border into Canada, and it was rewritten as what became known as PGP International. So trying to put controls on that kind of technology is actually impractical. And the whole area of dual use technologies is one that one can go into in a great deal of depth. But even if you were to pass it in one jurisdiction, it was outlawed, let's say the UK government outlawed encryption, and indeed the wider population abided by that law, it wouldn't actually stop criminals using the technology, because organized crime, as I said before, is often it's they commit the crimes and they're organized across borders. So there's no guarantee that other countries would ban encryption as well. So you could find out that actually all you're doing is disadvantaging your own citizens by not allowing them to stay private, whilst the criminals would simply start to operate somewhere else. So the real issue with any of these soft technologies is there's nothing to stop ideas traveling and just being re-implemented in another country. So I think it would be fair to say, I think most people agree that trying to outlaw encryption is probably impractical. So one of the other methods, very early on, actually people said, well, what about key escrow? That's where everybody has to put in a copy of their encryption key into some agency or possibly a trusted third party. And if they need to, they can get a warrant, they can go along to whoever holds this, they can retrieve the key and they can decrypt your communications. It sounds simple enough. But the problem is, again, devil's in the detail. Most modern encryption typically employs forward security, as you all know, I'm sure. The encryption key is changed with every new interaction. So the database of keys would be absolutely ginormous. It would be impractical. And also, who's going to hold that? Is there going to be one international body that does that? Is it every country has their own repository of these keys? It would not only be difficult to implement across many, many countries, but of course it would be a target itself for hackers. And do you really want to set up that kind of target? As we've sadly seen in the modern world, not all countries cooperate. And at the moment, if you the mutual legal assistance requests that go between countries when they're requesting information, it became very difficult in the last few years, for example, to go to the Russians and ask them to take some action or to provide some information. So key escrow, for all these reasons and many others I could spend time going on, it's not really practical. It's not a practical solution. So the other obvious thing to do is, well, why don't we weaken encryption so that the government themselves could crack it? And you could achieve that. You could weaken the algorithm, or you could restrict the key lengths, such that if somebody can afford enough computing power, they can crack it, and they can decrypt it. I mean, because one of the things about encryption is it's not forevermore. All encryption can be cracked. It's just it's a matter of resources and time. And the reason that people, for example, keep extending the length of keys is that they don't want people at some point in the future to be able to go back and decrypt something, or to start now and decrypt it, I don't know, maybe even 30 years in the future, because it may still be a piece of information that they want to remain confidential. And indeed, a lot of banks these days, a totally different subject, but a lot of banks now are switching and getting ready for quantum computing, even though, I work in the area, I'd say I can tell you it's always been 10 years away, and I've been in the business 40 years. So we don't know when quantum computers come in, but in terms of the algorithms that are used at the moment for end-to-end encryption, you could crack it in seconds. But what the banks are thinking is forward. They're thinking, well, the data that we hold today, if quantum computing suddenly came around and good old Shor's algorithm got rolled out, and they could crack the way things are encrypted today and do it in 30 years' time, that might still actually be a problem, because the person affected might still be alive. We don't want their bank records to suddenly, all the communications between people about certain transactions to become public, or not become public, but actually, to go to be available to somebody who was never intended to see it. The other thing about weakening encryption is that if you do it for your enemies, you are doing it for your friends as well. And that showed up very much when I mentioned earlier on where the US tried to ban the export of PGP, one of the very first public encryption schemes. And what they insisted on, there was a so-called export version of various encryption algorithms. And that resulted in a form of attack, which until very recently, it was still going until very recently, called downgrade attacks, where you could convince another system to downgrade the cipher that it was using, such that it was crackable. That that's just it's good intentions, but I'm afraid, as I always say, the road to hell is paved with them. So you've got to be extremely careful if you try and weaken encryption in that way. The other way people say is, well, you just put a backdoor in it. Well, the trouble with backdoors is that criminals find them as well as the people that are supposed to know about them. So anything that's ever been tried of that nature has always been undermined very, very quickly, because it basically renders the encryption useless, and it's a form of circumvention that if you know how to do it, and of course people will instantly be looking for it, it means the baddies as well as the goodies will be able to get in. Now, again, there was a very good example of this back in the 90s, with the Clipper chip that was supposed to be incorporated. Basically, the American government were going to insist that the Clipper chip was in all PCs, for example. But it didn't take very long for somebody to work out how to break it, how to get into it. So it just rendered any kind of encryption on the systems or generated by the systems as useless. So again, I think most people agree that weakening encryption is a bad idea, because it will weaken it for everybody, not just the criminals. You could actually just force by law, and the EU are kind of going in this direction with the legislation regulations. They're coming around a boy again on communication systems. You could force service providers to actually give interception capabilities. You could say that the architecture of your client servers have to give access to an unencrypted form of the message. But as much as I personally disagree with what Snowden did, end-to-end encryption was a direct result, really, of what he revealed that was happening, which was various government agencies had access to the servers, and although your communications were secure and encrypted from you to the server and from the server to the recipient, whilst on the server, they were not encrypted. So it was the perfect place to have effectively a good old-fashioned wiretap. So there's also a point that, people, why did that force people to produce end-to-end encryption? Well, it's because in the first case, what was actually revealed was what was happening by the NSA and GCHQ. But of course, if you go to someone like Google or Apple, the majority of their customers are not in the UK or the US, and they don't they want to be able to trust what they're using, and that the US or the UK government can't look at their communications. So the profit motive drove all of them to build in end-to-end encryption into things like WhatsApp. There was already a thing called Signal. They just incorporated the Signal protocol, and hence you ended up with end-to-end encryption. You could, the only way of forcing it anyway, you would somehow have to force Apple and Google in their app stores to take those apps out. And that can be done. That you can say, I mean, you only have to travel from country to country to find out that the apps available in various countries are not the same. So practically speaking, you could, a particular country like the UK or within the EU, for example, what they're planning to do if they do get around to implementing this is to make those app stores not have the apps in them, so they're not available. But of course, anybody and I'm sure most people in the room, they know how to get around those geo-fenced application blocks. You could have ISPs blocking it at an IP address level for non-compliant services. Signal, for example, I was talking to Meredith Whitaker not so very long ago, who runs Signal. And she made the public statement, she said it in public, there's no secret about it. If a country were to try and do this, they would withdraw from that country, as they have indeed done from, you're not supposed to be able to get Signal or use Signal in China or Iran. But actually, they also have a series of proxy servers, which volunteers run, and allow people to get around any IP address blocking. So trying to force this interception capability you would have to get the big tech companies to play ball, and I'm not entirely sure they would. Now, obviously, the interception, there are more subtle ways of doing it. And to give a good example, it's called the Ghost Protocol, and it was proposed by GCHQ. And they were saying to the service providers, well, very well, okay, you maintain your end-to-end encryption, but at the very least, let us get into group chats. So if I'm talking to Steve or Joanna or someone, if a one-to-one communication, fine, we'll take that hit. But what about if there was a silent way of anybody that wanted to, from one of the agencies, NSA, GCHQ, joining that group, but not showing up as a member of the group? They would be able to read the communications of that group. It would only be used in exceptional circumstances, was the proposition. I mean, there was a paper written, there was an article written here. Ian Lever had long discussions with the Ians about it, where, actually most of the building blocks to do this are already in something like WhatsApp. I don't know if any of you have tried, for example, to use WhatsApp, not on your phone, but actually on your iPad. You can do it. You just simply have, you get a QR code for the app that's on your iPad. It therefore says it's a valid app, and it basically allows you to mirror what's happening on the phone on the iPad. Now, you can see it's not a million miles away. If someone was able to do that and not show up, let's suppose I was able to do that, but my iPad never showed up. I didn't realize all my messages were being mirrored there. That's effectively what the Ghost Protocol is trying to do. You won't be surprised to learn that when it was proposed, there was a lot of arguments, including it was all published in the journal Lawfare. But very quickly, people like the Internet Society came out and explained why they didn't think it was a good idea. And I'm sure you can imagine what all of those were. Also, I think it's fair to say that the law enforcement agencies do actually have alternatives, whilst it might frustrate them. If you look at the Investigatory Powers Act, for example, in the UK, where I remember when the Solicitor General was actually drafting this law, a guy called Robert Buckland had long cups of tea with him and chatted about it, and primarily because he's a neighbour. And he accepted that you couldn't ban encryption, but there had to be some way of getting hold of this information. And that's where they came up with the concept of, and it's a fairly obvious one, equipment interference. You basically you put some spyware, government-sanctioned spyware on the device, and it can monitor it. And it has actually been done. I don't know if any of you have heard of EncroChat. You probably have. But EncroChat was a secure phone system, used end-to-end encryption, apparently. But what the French police managed to do, it was based in France, and they got into the server that sent software updates, and they put in a piece of effectively spyware. And come the next update, all the phones downloaded this, and it led to 700 arrests, including some ongoing high-profile investigations and prosecutions in the UK. So there are other ways of approaching this, and indeed, one of the arguments against having mass surveillance, just being able to sit on and capture everything on the server, is in this day and age, you would be overwhelmed by it. So actually, law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, they tend to they need to focus in on who is the person of interest, by doing what's called link analysis or traffic analysis. So who messaged whom, when, from where, and for how long. And from that, you can start to build up social maps, for example. If you know A is a terrorist, talking to B, who's a terrorist, if B talks to C, can you make a reasonable assumption that C is also involved somehow? Certainly they become a person of interest. You can do the good old policing technique of follow the money. And you may not be aware of Chainalyzer. It's worth having a look at. Only the police law enforcement agencies have access to it. But when people realized that cryptocurrency was being used for 70% of criminal to criminal transactions, at least in Europe, they used a piece of work from a very clever lady called Sarah Mickeljohn up at UCL on doing cluster analysis on what is a piece of public information, i.e. the blockchain. The privacy in the blockchain is that people think it's anonymous because it's numbers. You don't know who is associated with different wallets. But what Chainalyzer does is allow you to start to infer that. You can have the undercover policing, join the chat groups. Quite a lot of policemen out there pretending to be 14-year-old girls. Or you can hack back. And indeed, that's happened in the dark markets. The Dutch police found out where it was, broke into it, and they actually ran one, I think, called Hansa for a month. They gained not only the intelligence about who was running it, but who was using it.
Alan,
sellers that were using it.
Alan, can I just interrupt? We're running short of time on the
Okay.
slot. So if could move to the
last slide.
Oh, we're pretty much there.
There you go. So the bottom line is you have to have strong encryption for all or for none. There is no real middle ground. When you actually look into the details, there's no middle ground. And I would argue it's not that great a block to preventing harm in the way some politicians cite. There are methods for accessing the encrypted data, but they do require the authorities to have some prior reason to set somebody as a person of interest. So it's surveillance of a small set of people rather than the previously conducted mass surveillance. So I just finish off with what emerges from all of this, which is the ethical question. Is it better to allow forms of encryption that prevent the government from conducting mass surveillance? They can't go on I could call it a fishing trip. They can't detect the crime as ahead of time. So you're not allowing mass surveillance in order to ensure that privacy. Or should we actually sacrifice the privacy? Would you be willing to sacrifice your privacy? I no longer have access to end-to-end encryption if it enabled government agencies to detect crime at a very early stage. So it's not black and white. It's you get people who will say yes and no, but I think it's complex and the debate will continue for some time into the future. But hopefully what that demonstrates is the ethical considerations are sometimes multidimensional. Okay, that's me.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah, absolutely right. This is an ongoing discussion that I think will be going for a long time. There's lots of applause and thumbs up coming up on the screen, but so we're going to save our questions for the end, for the panel discussion. So we'll move on to the next talk. I'll invite Javed to come up, and while we get the technology screen back here. Okay, so yeah, all set, ready to go. So very pleased to welcome for our next speaker, Javed Malik, who's going to be talking about the kind of ethical responsibilities of organizations. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Always great to hear Alan speak. I could hear him go on for another half hour. So I was a bit disappointed that I was up next. Cool. So this is my vanity slide. It basically says I'm awesome. That's all you need to know. So we have technology. Why do we worry about people? Because ethics is very much a people thing. Well, we talk a lot about ethics built into the technology, but I'm talking more about from a people awareness or a people insecurity perspective. There's an awful lot of effort that we put into training people, building a secure culture, wanting people to do the right thing. But do we need to put that much into it? And the question that often comes up is well, what's the worst that could happen? And for those of you that might have recently seen, there was a French company that got hit by ransomware, and the ransom was demanded in Bitcoin and French bread. So that's an example of something absolutely terrible that could happen. No, it feels like one of those things where they were just trolling the victims to say give us 125,000 French bread rolls, and that will pay the ransom. So is it such a big deal? It can be a big deal. When there was a fired Disney employee who was in charge of looking after the menus in Disney, and they were fired, and it wasn't an amicable divorce, let's put it that way. And they still had access to the system to update the menus that were to be printed by a third party. So they went in and they said, these items with peanuts, no, they don't have peanuts in it, it's perfectly safe. And they also changed the QR code for some of it to point to some activist sites that they supported. Now, you can imagine, had this been printed off in mass and gone to all these Disney restaurants in their parks and elsewhere, and you have a severe peanut allergy, that could have very, very dire consequences. And so, you know, we look at actions that people undertake, and they have very real impact on the real world. We at KnowBe4 experienced this ourselves firsthand a few months ago. So you might have seen the headlines. A North Korean hacker tricked a US vendor into hiring him and immediately tried to hack them. That vendor was us, KnowBe4. We were tricked into hiring this thing. So I got permission to share some of the details about this because I think it's a fascinating story, and hopefully we can unpack a few things from it. But the disclaimer is that Carl never got access to anything. Don't worry, KnowBe4 wasn't hacked. We just hired someone who was the wrong fit, I suppose. And Kyle is not his real name. The investigation is still ongoing, so we can't give out every single bit of detail. It was not a data breach, but I think it's important to share the story. So this is a stock photo. You go on, and this is a very trustworthy looking photo, apparently. People trust that face. So that's the face of someone that's very trustworthy on stock images, and so trustworthy that if you go to Sheldon Law Group, he's the founder and manager of the organization. If you go to Tarzan Group, he's also the CEO. If you go to careers, you can see like at here at another organization, he's right there, one of the experts there, Matt. So anyway, when the criminals that targeted KnowBe4, they used that image, but they were clever. They thought this face is everywhere on the internet. Let's not use the same face. Let's edit it slightly. So they superimposed like their own face over it because they knew that during the interview, you're going to be on a video call or something like that at some point. So that's how, you know, they kind of like just morphed the image and that was it. Now, it's not that difficult to see, you know, like many organizations, we publish a lot of information when we post job roles, like this is where it's going to be based, this is the salary, this is like the requirements and everything. And, you know, so it's really easy to look for remote jobs. So if you're, hey, I want to work remotely, that's great. So he applied to be a principal AI software engineer. They stole a US identity and they faked their background. So there's farms available, there's intermediaries available. There's a long story there about how there's a whole ecosystem there where I could go into the US and say, sell me an identity, give me a social security number, give me some background, all that kind of thing. So this person, they actually passed four interviews on Zoom. And our CIO said this was by far the best candidate out of everyone they interviewed. So, you know, and background checks all came back clear as well. So Kyle got the job. They were shipped a laptop, FIDO-enabled, YubiKey, all that good stuff. And then the first red flag was they asked for the laptop to be shipped to a different location. Oh, I'm moving in between, there's this, there's that. That's red flag number one. They got their laptop, they installed, and they tried and failed to install a password-stealing malware. Red flag number two. That's kind of red flag, I think we all agree. And then they tried to manipulate the session history logs. So that was red flag number three. So, you know, our EDR system, they kicked back some alerts. SOC was alerted. They tried to, they got in touch with them. They made some excuse. They said, come onto a call. We'll discuss, walk through the problems. They refused. And the laptop was isolated. And so that was the end of all of Carl's efforts. So 25 minutes after the first alert, everything was locked down. So that's why there was no breach per se. Carl was suspended. And we involved the Mandiant, really good forensics investigations company, and the FBI. The FBI actually did tell us that this is very, very common. Just a lot of people don't come out publicly with it. Some people, they actually end up getting breached and then they come out with it, or then they find out. Sorry. So, our CEO was notified, and he decided, let's publish a blog post, and the story went pretty viral. So lots of publications picked up the story, and at the end of the day, it showed us really the true face of cybercrime, the original Lil Kim. And the thing with North Korea is that it's a sanctioned country, and there's good reason for that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is the facts. That it's a sanctioned country, and Mr. Rocketman likes to make rockets with the pointy thing on top. So how does North Korea, being all sanctioned and stuff, finance all of their activities? And actually, cybercrime is probably their #1 route. Estimates put it at around $500 million annually of their income comes from cybercrime. That's what goes into the nation. If you follow what they do in the crypto world, they actually keep a lot of their currency outside of the country to fund activities outside. So that's like buying fake identities and all that kind of stuff. So when you put it together, it's like this is kind of like their IT workers program that we pieced together, and with conversation with the FBI. But you have control, you have some foreign-based employees, you have the infrastructure, laptop farms, and all the money gets funded back to Rocketman. So I think the question then becomes not whether it's an ethical responsibility for organizations to actually focus on the human side of security, but I think the question is, can we afford not to build resilience in people? Can we afford to ignore that side? Can we only rely on technology? Because for all intents and purposes, the background control checks and everything, they work fine. It's only when you look at the human aspect and the behavior aspect that today technology isn't at that point quite yet to do it. So when we look at crime, we look over here, like there was recently, a couple of weeks ago, 3 million a day lost to fraud in the UK. And, I think the question that I think, as we went through this with the whole North Korea thing, is like, how would I feel if I knew that I work for a company, I downloaded an attachment that resulted in ransomware, my company had to pay the ransom, and that ransom then went to fund something far worse. Obviously, I've used the clickbait headline here of how would you feel if it funded a missile strike, but I think that is not too far from reality. So then the question is like, okay, that's nice, but how do we change people's behavior? Because behavior change is really, really hard. I've been trying to lose weight for the last 7 years. As you can tell, I've not managed to lose weight. You don't need to laugh that much, Denise. It's like I feel a bit attacked now. But okay, so I think to change that in organizations, to make people adopt more secure behaviors, is we need to think more like marketers and less like trainers. Trainers is like where someone walks into a dojo and you give them a white belt and then you want to make them a black belt. That's not right what we're trying to do. We're just trying to change a few key behaviors and make them slightly better. We just want people to recognize some of the red flags and report them. And then a black belt can sort out that issue. That's all we want to do. And as you've probably seen in James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, he talks a lot about the power of tiny changes. Just 1% better every day can compound and make a massive, massive difference by the end of the year. Another aspect that we really think about a lot is the power of storytelling. And storytelling is a powerful medium to share information. It's been handed down from generations, really. And we created this series called The Inside Man at KnowBe4. We just launched season 6 at the moment, and it's like a Netflix show. It's like little short episodes. It's a drama. There's characters. There's all this sort of stuff going on. And at the end of every episode, there's like, hey, did you spot that? Someone tailgated someone into the office. Someone plugged in a USB drive that they shouldn't have. So it's a bit of a learning moment in it as well. And it's so good that people email us and they say, hey, I was working for our company. We were halfway through season 3, and now I've left the company. Can you please give me access? I really want to find out what happens to AJ at the end of the episode, or whoever at the end of the season. And that's amazing, because I've never in my life felt compelled to go back to an organization I worked for and say, like, I was halfway through the anti-money laundering training. Please let me know what happens at the end. You know, that just doesn't happen unless you include that power of story so people can relate to it and engage with it and make it real. The other thing we focus on quite a lot is nudges. It's like small interventions, in-time training, just to help people to do the right thing. And so, you know, rather than like giving you know, in addition, I suppose, to your overall training, if your email could then give you like, hey, here's some signs of phishing, or here's some signs that this might not actually be your CEO. Or there was a university earlier in the year, was it last year, that the head of she had banned people from starting emails with, I hope this email finds you well. And then one of their staff got an email from a criminal saying, claiming to be from the head of the faculty, saying, I hope this email finds you well, please can you blah, 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 blah. And that was what gave them away. And that's how they figured out what it was. But wouldn't it be great if we could have little nudges built in that could sort of like indicate to us, like, the domain name isn't quite right, the name isn't quite spelt right, that the tone might not be what we're expecting. And by tapping into all the controls we have already, so everyone out there, most organizations, I shouldn't say everyone, I say most organizations out there have some form of endpoint security. They have some sort of web security. They have some sort of gateway. They have some sort of network control. They have all these controls there. So all the data is there. We just need to pull it out, put a human lens onto it, say, what are these people doing? Why are they doing it? And then you can understand patterns, and you can like build something that is personalized to an individual. I think there's nothing more annoying than getting training like, here's how you stay secure when you're traveling for work, and you never travel for work anyway. So like, why do I have to do this training? It's just not relevant to me. It means nothing. Wouldn't it be great if that was tied into your booking system? So every time you booked travel, it would then send you a reminder saying, hey, looks like you booked travel. Here, just a reminder, here's what the policy says. And by doing that, we start changing individuals' behaviors. And when we could start to change more than individuals, collectives, groups of behavior, then that's where you can start to influence the culture. And the culture is the shared social behaviors and organization that influences security. And I think pushing that further, we can even influence society at large to engage in more secure behaviors. So fewer people can fall victim. So we can bring down that 3 million a day that's lost to fraud. But I also think equally important is you get the culture you ignore. And so say, for example, like in your office, you don't wear your badge and you never get challenged. You know, what's going to happen is you're not really going to bother wearing your badge. After a while, your colleagues next to you say like, well, he doesn't wear his badge. Why should I wear my badge? And after a period of time, a year maybe, you're going to have a culture where no one's wearing their badge and no one knows, are they a member of staff? Are they a contractor? Are they a criminal just, you know, waltzing in, trying to steal stuff from me? So I think we need to focus on those parts. The bits that we ignore are just as important as the noisy bits that we need to focus on. And I think that's where we can build real resilience in people. And I don't think it is a choice. I think it's a requirement of organizations to really focus on that human side. And I think like there are many benefits you get from building culture. You know, you have better data protection. I think you get better transparency. Because what, if someone makes a mistake, you want them to come out and say, hey, look, I done this. Someone texted me and said, give me your MFA code. And I gave it thinking it was HR. That's beneficial to us. if they're afraid that they're going to be penalized for that, they're not going to do it. It's like someone told me an example yesterday. Imagine air traffic control. In an airport, there's a mechanic, and he services an airplane or some engine, and he comes back and he's short one spanner. You want them to inform their superiors that, hey, let's not fly this plane. There might be a loose spanner somewhere inside. So let's take this multi-million-pound hit by taking that airplane out of commission and stripping down the engine to find that spanner. That's a hard choice to make. That's really hard. But that's the ethical decision to make. And that's what we want to do with cybersecurity as well. If people click on something, if they download something, if they give away credentials, we want to create that environment where there is that transparency, where there is that fairness, where there is that people feel like that it's the right thing is the easy thing to do. And, you know, it'll offer you lots of other benefits too. But I'll wrap it up there. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thanks, Joed. So yeah, so save your questions, keep track of them, and we'll have the opportunity for questions after we've had the talks. So next up, Ehsan from the University of Surrey, also Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity. We'll be talking about the future of ethics. So yeah.
Hello. So hi everyone. My talk will be a little bit less technical and more philosophical. So but should I point it? Yeah. How does it work? Oh. So. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I will talk about the future of ethics in cybersecurity in a way, but I will base my discussion based on two quotes that I will first propose by Churchill. The longer you look back, the farther you can look forward. So it's like for talking about future, it's very good to have an idea of what has happened in the past. And then the second is from Nietzsche. It's like a man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman, a rope over an abyss. That's a very philosophical term. But in general, what he meant here is that there is an idea of the last man. And the last man, in principle, in his word, is the last man is someone that has no struggle, no inner struggle. And in his mind, it was a bad thing. So the end of history is where the last man exists, and there is no struggle as a mankind. So with that, I will start talking about the past. And I will, past in my mind is a little bit looking into the world of ethics and what it means in general, where the roots of the word itself comes from. It comes from the Greek words, obviously, ethos, and it's based on Aristotelian rationality. So in mindset of Aristotle, a debate or a message is convincing if it has three characteristics. The first one is ethos, focusing on credibility of the presenter, pathos, appeal of the audience's emotion, and logos, the logic behind it. So ethos itself forms the ethicus, and then that means morality and showing moral character. So if you want to have a more understanding of it, that would be a good chart. So it's like ethos is very much combined with confidence, experience, knowledge, credential, endorsement, moral. But there's a piece of rationality in it. But when we talk about ethics in the current format, it's not really a rational thing. It's a very emotional act. So for that, I would like to borrow a little bit of principle from Platonic soul. That is, he proposed the idea of tripartite soul. Every soul, it has three different parts: logos, thumos, and epithos. So in his mind, which was an old day sort of principle, so it's not really medical thing, reason is located in a head, focusing on rational and the parts that you try to seek truth, wisdom, and rationality in everything. So spirit is thumos, located in the chest, focusing into emotions, particularly courage, ambition, and drive for honor and justice. And the last one is appetite, or epithumia, which is located in the stomach and focusing on, bodily desires such as hunger, thirst, or everything else that follows with it. So I want to look a little bit more into thumos. So in his mindset, Thumos is actually a connection between logos and epithumia. So basically that means a spirit, a spirited part. So it's basically, it is something that creates this connection. And if you don't get the recognition of that, that's somehow, if I want to define it, it's kind of like, this is the part of human psyche or soul that demands respect and recognition. If you don't get that, you'll get angry. So, and that is actually interesting. I'm not the best person to talk about Greek, but this thumos is actually used in modern Greek as well. And the exact meaning is anger. So the whole point is if you don't get the recognition, you get angry. So having that in mind, it's kind of like, it is an inner drive for justice and courage. So when you have nothing to do, there is no financial or there is no meaningful gain, but you confront wrongdoing and kind of because of something feels morally wrong. If you want to defend your friend, if you want to have a promotion or something, it's something that you won't have the recognition for it. And that is somehow summarized my look at the past, that if you want to convey a message, rationality and emotion are somehow combined together. There is a balance. The message and the messenger are both combined together. They are very important for that to make your message believable. So with that, I will talk a little bit about my idea of what's happening in the present time. So my idea of ethics at the moment is very much compliance focused. So if you're following a little bit of regulation, you try to comply with that, and then you show, okay, so that's ethical. GDPR, security standards, different standards all around, that's all that's happening. And it's very fine from my point of view, but there is a problem that technologies are getting more intrusive into our personal space. So they're talking about our health life, micro-targeting, monetizing our personal data. So in that sense, my key question is, all of them or technologies, is it enough to just follow the regulations for what they want? And then what is that thumos that I talked about? Where does it stand in? So I want to make it a little bit more clear by focusing on two specific case studies. The first is the case of female-related technologies. It's mainly health-related technologies, but focusing for the target audience of female. It's actually a very good market. It's projected to be around more than $100 billion before 2030. But the first thing that we noticed when we were analyzing the privacy practices or ethical practices here is majority of them are not FDA approved. And that seems to be an intentional act. They were deliberately avoiding the usage of words such as AI, such as sort of machine learning in their profiles. And they were trying to just market it, although they were all health related, market it as something that is not sort of really related to health regulations as the FDA approval requires. So, but then we looked into how they are selling their items in their web pages. So this is just, we chose 10, one of them, we went to their websites, we did a complete forensic analysis on how their tracking practices in their websites only is. And all of them are technically GDPR compliant, but you can see there is no opt-out for cookies. Majority of them, they don't provide any agency for the tracking sort of protections. And all of them are actually having some sort of tracking. So it could be third-party implanting, more complicated tracking behaviors such as browser fingerprinting or these sort of things. At the same time, the companion apps for those, they had gaining a lot of information to something that is not required. For example, if you look at this Garmin Lily Watch, which is just a health tracker, you get a lot of information about camera and microphone, sensor data, calls and contacts, storage, or calendar, or some things that are actually not quite there. And then we did another experiment on the sort of communication of the device, between the device and the companion app, focusing only on the Bluetooth communication. And a lot of them, we managed to implement man-in-the-middle attack, replay attacks, connection hijack, denial of service, denial of sleep. So different sorts of attacks to these platforms, which are all compliant to the regulations in a way. So in another sense, in another sort of research, what we did is we looked into web tracking in general. So by the way, if you are interested, these are the two papers related to this. So more than happy to share it later. But then what we did is we studied the 100 top sites in the EU. So technically all of them are compliant to GDPR. We merely focused on how the cookie notice has been shown. And you can see for 20 out of 100, you don't really see much, or you don't get a lot of options. And at the same time, when you have the option and you click on accept, and then you want to opt out, you can see there is a clear distinction between the pattern of the usage. So the number of clicks that you require to opt out, if you previously accepted it, opt out the data collection is double the time, the number of clicks that you have for just getting kind of rejected in the first place. And that was somehow an indication that, okay, so although the GDPR itself is compliant, in practice, it's not really showing any respect to the user. But then the question here is, okay, so imagine if that's the case, what can we do about it? What can we do to replace that in general? So can we look into moral compass as just democratic ethics? The majority agrees on something, there is some sort of normality or culture, and then we can focus on that. There are many problems with that. The first is how we can ensure the minorities, or ethics itself, or public norm, or moral compass is actually very subjective matter. So it goes through culture, political, religion, time, dates, and everything else. So in a very large scale research published in 2018 in Nature, the authors did more than 2 million people. They researched more than 2 million people all over the world. They presented them with 13 scenarios, all focusing on the trolley problem. So it's just choosing people from different sort of combinations. And the findings of that research were very interesting in terms of how the world looks into ethics. For example, people from countries with a strong governments, such as Finland and Japan were more likely to choose the people who are illegally acting, doing the illegal act of crossing the street. On the other hand, people who the disparity between poor and rich are actually randomly choosing people, where in countries like Colombia, which there is a big gap between rich and poor, people try to choose a person to be killed that is a little bit lower in terms of financial income. So in general, they divided the world into 3 different categories: North American and a lot of Christian-based countries, this reddish color. That's the first category. The second one is Japan, Indonesia, Pakistan, or the countries with Confucian and Islamic tradition. And the third one is really interestingly France, its colonies, and a little bit from southern America. And you can see these charts are somehow representative of how these different regions chose ethics. So for example, if you look at how we can spur the young, you can see there is a clear distinction between the countries of Confucian and then the French-based countries. So in another case, how people look at privacy in terms of how they apply privacy or pets technologies, we asked around 700 people all around Europe, it's mainly focusing on UK, Germany, and France, and trying to quantify their negative feeling about tracking. So you can see a lot of people, majority actually, don't have good feeling about tracking. But when it comes to applying the technologies for their protection, majority of them, they don't apply anything for protection of their track. So it's kind of like, okay, you are unhappy about it, but you are doing nothing. So that somehow is indication that Maybe only relying on people for ethics is not actually some another replacement for basically compliance focus. So the moral compass approach as a summary can be confusing. It's not concrete. You cannot really summarize it in one sentence or another. And then compliance is losing the human touch. So that's the ethos part that I talked about. So, and now I want to wrap up these two from the two dimensions that I talked about into what happens in the future, in my mind, or what is going on at least. Right. So I would borrow my discussion from Francis Fukuyama, who is a Stanford-based political scientist. And the reason I do that is because at the end of Cold War, when Berlin Wall fell in 1992, he proposed the idea of the end of history and the last man, borrowing the exact notion from Nietzsche that, okay, so we are at the end of history and the last man is there. But he mentioned it as a very positive approach. He said that the highest form of civilization is a liberal democracy tied with market economy. And that was a very famous quote. So if you search for it, you're gonna see a lot of buzz around that word. Still goes on. So he mentioned we are at the end of history. In 2020, in his speech in Munich Security Conference, he actually proposed something else, which was somehow in conflict with his initial idea. That, okay, so populism is now challenging the foundations of liberal political order, constitutional order, checks and balances, and goes on. So in his recent book, actually, he identifies the main problem, at least in the political spectrum, looking into how political order decays and how political institutions sort of dysfunction. It's kind of like people just don't want wealth and prosperity. They want respect, they want recognition, they want public recognition for that sort of success. And maybe he summarized that the current political spectrum is what about us, as regarding of what your political agenda is. That's maybe the core of the question, that you don't see that thumos in the political system, so you try to seek different approaches to that. In my mind, the same logic applies in the technical world. So it's like there are consequences if you don't show people the respect that they want to get, or at least they want some recognition of them being themselves in a way. So I would just argue that maybe philosophically speaking, that explains the reason of public interest in decentralized, no trust sort of systems that, such as blockchain, that's kind of like they want to have more control in what they are looking into, and then that somehow explains the aspect of thumos in the ethical compliance. So, for example, in the case of tracking that I explained, you can see that the tracking actually makes a lot of people annoyed and makes a lot of people angry in a lot of sense. So that somehow shows that, okay, the personal data as a commodity is an advertisement, and that makes people angry. So, but what can we do about it? And that's somehow maybe focusing on implications of compliance-focused ethics is not an enough sort of thing or discussion. So in my mind, at least for now, talking about only ethics, the future of cybersecurity is actually a combination of autonomy and human dignity at the same time. So the ethos part is actually going to be fulfilled by the compliance. But then the thumos part will be more looking into agency. So looking into agency, meaning, in my mind, it's more privacy by design, more security by design, ethics by design, or these are all by design sort of terms that are out there. But at the end of the day, these sort of things that you need to give individuals some sort of respect, some sort of freedom on their sort of understanding of it. So, and in my mind, I'm optimistic in general. So I would say there is actually, this thing is actually happening. So I can see there is a paradigm shift in compliance-focused ethics. It is actually getting more proactive than reactive. And there are standardizations that are somehow merely focusing on ethics. for example, in W3C, there is the privacy or PING, the privacy interest group, is one of the 4 horizontal groups in W3C that every standardization in W3C should have their approval for they need to have a section on privacy. They need to consider sort of privacy in their act. And the same sort of approach is happening in different standardization and regulation bodies. So the Trustworthy AI EU Act is advocates for ethics by design, NIST cybersecurity framework, encourages everyone to follow privacy by design, security by design. The work of Ann Cavoukian, who is a Canadian, very famous Canadian privacy advocate, is actually very much related to establishing a privacy framework in legislations in Canada, and the different sort of attempts that are happening all around standardization acts. And one thing that I want to just highlight is that might be not enough in terms of that. So there is always some work to do. What I would argue is, okay, so when we talk about people, there is somehow a large, different spectrum of people, and then if all of them, they have different needs. So for example, in case of visual impaired users, especially for object recognition, that's a different notion than a regular person who wants to do some sort of regular work. For them, it's the way of their life, in the way they see by using the object sort of recognition in a way. And that's privacy by design approaches or different things is actually a very major element in those more vulnerable or less capable groups than normal groups. And that's something that I think it is not there yet, but I hope the work of all of us will lead us there. So to summarize, I would just say, okay, message and messenger are both important, and then there is always a balance. There must be balance between compliance and agency, and I can see that, but let's see what will happen in the future. That's just something that I anticipate will happen. Yeah, but with that, I will just conclude my talk. I hope I was on time.
Thank you very much, Ehsan. So finally, we have John Chapman. Very pleased to welcome who's come over from Bristol to talk to us today. We'll be talking, I think this is the bravest title here, The Only Way is Ethics. So I'll pass over.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for. I feel rather that the presentation I'm about to give is in some way a summary. There's lots of things that have been covered this afternoon by many people who are more expert than I. But I thought I'd start off with this quote from cyber professionals need to know ethical principles are what separates cybersecurity professionals from hackers. Therefore, I would say the only way is ethics, and obviously it's. But there you go. At least if you don't remember what I said, you'll remember the title of the subject anyway. Some of what we were going to cover, I wasn't quite sure about the level of knowledge of the audience, so I could range from technical to overview, and there's a bit of both. The other thing I'd like to say is that looking at ethics in cybersecurity, there are ethical considerations for cybersecurity itself, but also ethical considerations in what information are we trying to protect, what are we trying to do, and sometimes I go more towards one and more towards the other, and I couldn't find a delineation between them. But why am I here? I am a more mature student, a fourth-year PhD at University of Bristol. I had 30 years in the Royal Air Force as a fast jet pilot and as information systems specialist, then 10 years in Dell Corporation, finishing as CISO for the UK public sector before coming back into academia. So I have a different view on many of the things. And my thesis is around the impact, technical and social impact of quantum technologies on smart cities, and ethics is part of that. And one thing I want to pick up on from Ethan already is that the CDT, Center for Doctoral Training, that I'm in, cybersecurity CDT at Bristol, is very heavily impacted on responsible innovation. Looking at what you're trying to bring in and to find what are likely to be the unintended consequences of this. And that permeates throughout, I think, the introduction of new technologies, quantum or otherwise. So a discussion of some of the ethical challenges. I'm just known as JC. That's why I put that up there. So what is ethics? Well, again, Ethan's done a really good job on giving the background to what ethics is. A set of moral principles or moral values. That's one. Code of conduct. This is me looking online. What can I find out about what is ethics? But the ethical concepts, they're going to vary across different cultures and different individuals. And we need to be able to assess that. Some hold to their values and say, no, that's my value. I'm not going to change that. Others say, well, you know, if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to have to break some eggs. And that's leading towards, well, I don't really want to do it, but somebody's got to do it. And we'll cover that a little bit later as well. And we don't have time right now to have the ethical discussion, but Ethan has covered that very nicely. So more particularly, what is ethics in cybersecurity? And I think for me, I started looking online, what can I find out about ethics? Now, one of the things that I've done in the past, and I've been a member of the International Information Systems Security Certification Consortium. Wow, that's a mouthful. But if you're not aware of ISC squared and you are a professional within cybersecurity, it is very much worthwhile looking at it. They have a code of ethics, and as a CISSP, Certified Information System Security Professional, I am bound by their ethical principles to protect society, common good, act honorably, etc., etc. Okay, so they're guidelines. Does that help me much? Well, it still depends on my interpretation of that. I look to ISO. Do we have a code of ethics and conduct? Well, yeah, we do. But again, they're really just guidelines. So how do we decide what we should be doing and who's going to guide us in that? So for me, two main ethical elements, and I covered it right at the beginning. What ethics are we trying to preserve, to protect? What is it that we're actually out there saying, this is significant, this is what we want to try and protect? And then what are the ethical considerations in achieving the task of trying to protect that? So I'll be looking at both of those. Who's involved? Well, perhaps three main actors involved. First, we're looking at government, international bodies, the policymakers, and who actually are these people? Secondly, the organizations doing the protecting. And then thirdly, those who are developing new techniques, those who are technologists, researchers, developers, what ethical considerations? And the next few minutes, I'll be trying to look at the ethics for each one of those individual bodies and see if we can dive into what each of those bodies should be doing. So looking at, to begin with, government or governance, because I don't think it's necessarily state government that are going to be running this. But the responsibility should be monitoring technical developments. The issue is that very often they don't have the necessary experience or the knowledge to be able to monitor what's going on. There's work ongoing with government in looking at the future of quantum technologies, and on the board of people who are looking at it, the board consists of about 12, 15 people. There's only one person who is actually qualified in quantum technologies. So should they be making the rules, or should it be driven by commercial bodies? Should we just say, well, Google are the biggest, or it could be Microsoft are the biggest? Should they be dictating policy? Should they? One of the issues about developing standards, and again, Ethan covered this, is that if you do it too early, you're going to jump to the wrong thing. If you do it too late, then commercial have already decided what it should be. So it's a very difficult situation of trying to come up with the right policies at the right time. So they should be dictating or advising, but at least they should be doing work on what should be protected, when it should be protected, by who should be doing the protecting, and under whose authority. And then finally, they should be affecting those. So this is a little bit from perhaps GDPR, then said, okay, these are the rules around it. Affecting that's going to be down to individual countries. So then the UK had ICO, etc. But they should also be providing training or certification. And when I come later to say we should have ethics training, well, ethics training from where? By whom? Who should be providing it? There don't seem to be any certification for ethics training. I could be wrong on that, of course. But looking initially at some of the policy considerations, and it's been mentioned, GDPR. Well, that's great. Provided that you're in the European Union or thereabouts. But what about developing cybersecurity protocols or techniques that are going to be globally available? Well, it could be CCPA in California. It could be CPPA in Canada. Canadian Consumer Privacy Protection Act. The one in Germany, I'm not even going to try and pronounce BDSG. Or in China. In China actually have a Chinese personal information protection law. How each of those works and how you develop techniques that should be covered for all of those, best of luck. And of course, GDPR for the UK ended up in the UK Data Protection Act 2018. But there's also other ways that you can protect. And we had a discussion earlier from Alan was saying, well, one of the ways that we could affect some of this is by looking at the technology itself. What is it that the technology, what is it that hardware and the firmware are asking us to do? And I'll give you an example of that a little bit later. And that is, see the example of air fryers. I promise I'll talk about air fryers. Finally, the UK National Security Strategy, ethics guiding principles for practicing professionals. Again, it doesn't tell me what I should be doing. How am I supposed to try and find that out? Well, let's look then at the responsibilities of the organizations. These are the organizations that are affecting it. These are the ones that are doing the defending of what somebody else has decided you should be defending against or preserving. Well, again, we've come across, Alan was saying, Professor Allen was saying all organizations really should have an ethical statement. They should have ethical values. And this should be for their business in total. And then their cybersecurity policy should comply with that. But how do they know what that should be? Well, you could look at ISO 27001 and it goes on about confidentiality, but also the responsibility and transparency. And I just want to come back to who is responsible and how are we ensuring that clear and concise information about the practices is available. Think about the introduction of AI and machine learning and think about the transparency issues associated what decisions are being made by machine learning. Are they really transparent? And do organizations have the right experience? Well, generally, the development of an ISMS is normally contracted out. But who are you contracting out to? How do you know whether the people that you're contracting out to are doing it in an ethical way? Do you just go, come in, do the stuff, thank you very much, tick in a box, away you go? What's then embedded into your system? How do you ensure contract staff have proven ethical credentials? Well, there are no ethical credentials that I know about. And perhaps Elaine can tell me that there are, that you should be able to go through this set of training. But I haven't seen any of that. And in my cybersecurity training, and bear in mind, yes, I've been programming since 1972, before probably any of you were born. And I've been involved in this work for many, many years. I've never had any ethics training at all. So the other thing is beware, and this is a particular example for organizations on what could be called information usage creep. And this is when you're in an organization and you're developing new cybersecurity or you're developing new information exploitation techniques. Wouldn't it be good if we use that information to do such and such? Now, that's a discussion that somebody maybe will be coming up with from, unlikely to be HR, more likely to be marketing. Who then says, whoa, is it ethical to do that? Should we really be doing that? Is that covered by any of the GDPR? Well, you could be GDPR compliant, but it's still not really ethical to do it that way. So where are the internal checks and balances on corporations? I'm not sure that we have any. And obviously you need to consider the information categories. Is it corporate? Is it personally identifiable information, or is it enhanced PII? And how do we ensure that these things are being protected? So ideally, I would just blindly say, well, CISOs should have ethics training. Well, I never did. I was a CISO for a number of years. And again, I'm not quite sure about the ethics training and where on earth we get it from. Briefly cover a defensive and offensive cyber, and Professor Allen covered some of this, but to give you an example. So you're in a company, you're a car manufacturer, who detects the competitors hacking details of the next mark of car that you're going to release, and the competitor is traced to an IP address in Germany. All right. So what can you do legally? Okay, it's in the UK. Well, you can improve your defenses. Whoa, we can do that. Everybody agree we can do that. You can block the source. You know where the IP is coming from. So rather than just blindly doing everything, that's my priority. That's the biggest threat I've got at the moment. I'm going to block the source. Yeah, we're all happy about that. What about disinformation? I'm going to feed that source, but I'm going to feed it with the wrong stuff. Interestingly, there's a book on what was the Tupolev 144, the Kontkorski, developed in competition to our Concorde. Didn't quite work very well. Was quite a lot of reasons why that might have been. And part of the book goes into how much we in the UK used disinformation because we knew it was being copied. So we simply leaked the wrong information so that when they developed it, it didn't work very well. Would we be allowed to do that if you're a company? Maybe. What about attacking it with malware? We know where it's coming from. We're just going to hit you back. Now we're going, no, we're not allowed to do that. And you're right. We're not allowed to do that. Only government institutions are allowed to conduct offensive cyber, at least in the UK. And as I said, I was in the military, and it was probably up until 2005 or 6 that we actually admitted that we did offensive cyber. Before that, no, we don't do that. We wouldn't do that. Well, of course we do. It's part of cyber ops. Okay, so in considering organizations, perhaps some ideas about what could be best practice for organizations. Establish a code of conduct for employees and for contract staff. And again, if you build the ethics into the people and you build little nudges here and there, that works really very well. Go on, click. I'm not clicking. Go page down. Thanks. Training, make people aware of their responsibilities. Absolutely right. Don't hit them with a stick. Try and encourage them as well. Certainly when I was in Dell, part of the phishing that used to come around every 3 months, you'd get little credits if you managed to be the first person who said, that's a training phishing email. And so is it about right now that we're getting that? If I get it first, I get some credits for that. And the Dell credits, which you can exchange for vouchers and things like that. It became part of a competition. They were really looking out for it, which is, I think, a good way to go. Conducting regular reviews by an outside agency, but how do you know what's a good agency? And don't be swayed by the financial pressures. We can make money out of this. Yeah, but the other one is, it'd be nice to check, but we can't afford to do it this year. And obviously, as a CISO, you're going to face that all the time. I'd love to be able to do that, but we can't afford it. So value for money. Poor practices in organizations, and these things we've come across. It really is bad to have outdated encryption tools. That's just not ethical. Patching efforts. But why do they do it? Well, I'll give you an example of a particularly unnamed health trust that I was working with when we had the WannaCry hit. And I went to see the head of IT, and I said, but you knew there was a patch. Why didn't you patch? You were 3 weeks before you got hit. You had plenty of time. And he said, well, I couldn't get the system downtime. The COO, the chief ops officer, said, how many medical operations do you want me to stop? Okay, that was back on an email. Why didn't you go in and say, well, how many operations are you going to have at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning? You know, can I just have 2 hours, please? To which the answer was, he won't give me the time of day. I've never even talked to him. And so that comes into interpersonal relationships. And during the time that I'm, giving some lectures at Bristol University, people coming through, really, really important to develop interpersonal relationships. So sometimes it's a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge, money, ethos, or, as I said, poor communication between those who can do something about it and those who hold the purse strings. Okay, third part of it, responsibilities of developers and technologists. In academic development, we have ethics boards. If I want to run a study, I've got to go through the Bristol Ethics Board, and I'll go, okay, are there minors involved? Are you going to be doing any trigger questions? Are you going to be looking at this? What's the impact? What about, etc. And it's really important to have diversity in a team, particularly experience is absolutely essential. And getting not just the standard people to do it, but to include lots of other people because they've got different views on what is ethical. And you need all of those views to be able to develop something. I don't know whether we have time to go through an encore example, but very briefly, this was a study done by an academia in the US where they were looking at how good are the techniques that people are employing in stopping people looking at commercially restricted sites. What actually happened was they put a little bit of software onto people's computers, which actually the people in the study weren't aware of, that tried to access various restricted sites in various ways. The detail's not important. But the point was that they didn't realize that this was occurring, but it was a really successful study that was then duplicated thousands and thousands of times, and not only in the US, it ended up being distributed all over the world. Suddenly, people were getting phone calls or getting people knocking on the door going, why are you trying to access these restricted sites? Because very many government institutions in foreign countries are not really happy if somebody's trying to access restricted sites. That was something that actually went through the ethics board and wasn't picked up. And that's part of responsible innovation, to look at what are the unintended consequences of what you're trying to do in the study. But what happens in commercial development? I mean, how many people in commerce have got ethics boards to say, well, I'm not quite sure we should be making money out of that. And it's about responsible innovation. Lots of discussions about responsible innovation. Backdoors. Well, I think Professor Allen's covered this particularly well, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But obviously, consider the event that a husband dies or details the family finances. Can a high court authorize the hack?
Sorry, can we just ask you to stand there? Just asking online if you can actually look at those slides and stand closer to your presentation, because
You want me to stand closer?
Because there's losing your sound. When
Oh,
you move
okay,
away.
right.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll stand this side. That's fine. But I won't stand in front of the slides. All right, thank you. So should a high court be able to authorize the hack? Well, that's an ethical question, and I think it's been pretty well covered. Can the state use a backdoor? What about using a honeypot? And going on to that, what about covert surveillance? I'll leave them up there because of the slides, but I think that's really well covered by Alan early. And what if it's state on state? So you can see it's not an easy question to answer to begin with. And it all depends on what your policy is towards ethics. And again, he pinched my stuff on unbreakable encryption. Should we have unbreakable encryption end to end? And I can't do anything any better than Professor Allen has already done it. Except, should it be available to everybody? Well, if you said yes, then what's the point of the cybersecurity provisions in ITAR that says you're not allowed to do that? So it depends on who's using it, where it is, and what it's destined to be used for. So it's not an easy question, and it's based on state-based normative framework. But as Ethan has covered, that's not really reliable, and that varies throughout the ages, and certainly varies across different cultures. Very quickly, white hats versus black hats, and I'd never come across gray hats. I've got enough 5 minutes. I hope so. Classification based on the motivations, intentions, and methods. White hats are these people. I want to improve security. Black hats, I want to exploit the vulnerabilities. There are those in between hats, really. They're working on it. Hey, I've come up with something, but you're going to have to pay me if I'm going to be able to release it. That's one of the examples of grey hats. They work in between. And some of the best black hats have become white hats. And obviously, the case of the hacker in the UK, the teenager was going to be sent to prison for what he did. And an American NSA went, well, before you do that, can we have him, please? Because he's really, really good. And obviously, they are very useful if you can convert them. But just a few questions, a few ideas on ethics to consider. What about disclosing vulnerabilities? When somebody discovers a cybersecurity vulnerability in software, firmware, or hardware, should you declare it? Well, if they do, before a fix is known, then it's open to abuse from criminals. But if they don't, then there's lots of people out there that go, I already know the answer to that. So the ethical issue is, should they allow people to continue using software, hardware, or firmware when they know that there's a known vulnerability? No, you shouldn't allow that at all. Well, actually, it's quite useful to some people. What if it's GCHQ or NSA that discovers the vulnerability? And they go, okay, I'm just not going to tell anybody about it. Now, that's happened for many, many years and many situations. So it's not an easy question to answer. That's all I'm saying. I've not got the answers to these, by the way, but I'm just trying to give some ideas. The intersection of AI and machine learning and ethics, I covered a little bit, but there's quite a lot of cybersecurity defenses that are growing up using artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning, looking at the attacks that they're getting, trying to track, and if it looks a bit like a hack, if it looks like malware, smells like hardware, it's operating like malware, it doesn't have a signature, they're not bothered with that, it's probably malware. So they'll learn from that and they'll learn to do the correct, they'll learn to do a particular reverse attack on it, or they'll learn to do something. Now, the reason I'm vague about that is because we're actually not quite sure what it is the machine learning algorithm ends up doing. So there has to be, in my view, some sort of threshold by which somebody else needs to look at that and say, is it ethical to do that? But it's also operational, because if you're running a website that sells tickets, and you suddenly get attacked and the machine learning algorithm says, the best thing to do is to bring the website down because they're destroying the fonts. You go, no, the boy band's just about to release all the tickets. You can just go destroy my business if you do that. So you have to be able to have that sort of decision-making process into it, because I prefer to run with a website that's got bad fonts on it rather than take it out altogether. But there's ethics associated with that might impact. It's because okay. So those are some of the things that you need to look at as far as machine learning and ethics. Trust and human oversight, I think, does need to be there, but it's very difficult to know what that threshold should be. Oh, and what about the right to be forgotten? That I was involved in, and still am involved in some studies looking about the right to erasure in machine learning. And that's, so you've decided to be part of the training set, but then, I'm not quite sure. I don't like the way that's going. I just want I just want to withdraw from that. I have the right to be forgotten. What, do you go back to the training set for every person that says I want to be forgotten and then try and rerun it? So there is a PhD study going on looking at methods by which you can use particular techniques to make sure you're ethically compliant with the right to be forgotten, but not have to go back and spend the expense about running the training system again and again. All right. I did promise I was going to say something about air fryers. 3 makers of air fryers, this is from the 5th of November Times article, have apps that want to record audio and phone and send your data to China. Egastar and sent personal data to China. Angzumi app connected to trackers from Facebook and TikTok. Now, when this was raised with the, oh, by the way, they required privacy consent in order to work properly for no apparent reason. And you mentioned, Ethan mentioned about the way in which people use dark patterns, they're called, on websites to say it's going to be really, really difficult to withdraw permission to be able to have cookies. And by the way, if you withdraw all of this, it's not going to work anyway. And for those, I think it's quite right, because if they want to be able to sell you something, they want to make money out of it, why should it be free to you? But if you don't want to give you permission, then don't use them. That's okay, in my mind, provided it's not something that's absolutely essential. And the one time I did report it to the ICO is because there's a government website that had there was a service, but every time I tried to say, no, I don't want any cookies, I don't want any of that tracking, well, it's not going to work then. Well, okay. but I'm supposed to use this. Now, in that particular case, that needed to be corrected. But if you are on a Femtech website that says, well, you've got to have all these cookies, well, just say, I'm not going to use it now. But this particular one was reported to the ICO and they said, oh, we're going to produce new guidance. Personal, I don't think that's strong enough. I think we should be looking at why information is being asked for, what it's likely to be used for, and if it can't justify that, then some sort of BSI stamp or some sort of authority to be able to use in UK or wherever, it's AICO, so it'd be UK, should be withdrawn. Because I don't think that's good enough. That's me.
Well, thank you very much, John. So, yeah, plenty of questions there. It's a nice bringing together of all the things that we've seen through the afternoon. So I think time has been running on. I think we've got time for maybe 2 questions maximum. So we'll ask the speakers to come up for the panel. We normally would have a bit longer, but I think the talks have been so engaging that we've kind of run them on. So I do have a question online, but first of all, I'll ask if there's any questions from the audience or quite. There's a couple there. Okay, we'll have this one and then we'll have this one. So yeah, please.
Thank you to the presenters. Very interesting, very stimulating. And one question, in a year's time, do you think your presentations would be the same or could be quite different?
I've been giving the same presentation for 7 years. I think it's when you look back at the history, the technologies on the surface change, but the underlying motives and the ethics and the debates that we've been having, they've been going on for a very, very long time. So unfortunately, I don't think they'll change too much.
So you don't think the life experience may reprogram your ethics?
I think on an individual level, I think people make small changes and we do witness that, but it's a long, very slow change.
Mine will definitely change because I noticed there's 3 typos in it as I was. I would like to think that we would be able to get some sort of emphasis on ethics training. I'd like to think that responsible innovation, which is a mandatory part of our CDT PhD studies, can be broadened so that we don't make the silly errors, but that's a desire rather than my expectation. I'm not quite sure we're going to get there, but I do feel, again, as Ethan pointed out, that we are moving to a different mindset. People are getting more understanding about what people are asking for online, and they're beginning to get some pushback. Whether government agencies are keeping up to speed with that, I don't. I reserve judgment. So I'd like to say it's going to change and things are better, but I'm not quite sure it will.
The first half wouldn't change. It was about that. But the second one, I think I would like to see more data or actually numbers on how is privacy by design or responsible design are implemented out there in technological sort of platforms. That would be the change that I would look for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So question over here.
Yeah, I mean, outside of my day job, I do research on online vigilantism, and there's a theory from cyber psychology called the online disinhibition effect, which says people behave online differently to how they would in the real world, in inverted commas. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how that theory might be relevant to cybersecurity and ethics.
I'll take that. They very definitely behave differently online. There are plenty of criminals that have been, they're not willing to come forward, but who have been interviewed. And they say, well, if you were face to face with this person, would you actually have done that? I go, well, no, probably, but I'm anonymous. So I can just go to bed at night and not think it happens. I think people are too trusting online, but I do think that that's changing. I really wish that people would think about, they often say, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper, but don't believe everything you read online either. But with echo chambers, you're familiar with that, then it's getting pervasive. And even within the family, we can have discussions. And for those people who continually look at a particular topic, I can already see that they're working one way. There are some people, and there is an agency which is trying to stop that. And what they're trying to do is look at all of the news feeds and put back into the news feeds a middle ground, and saying that you may consider that you're being dragged. Do you realize that this? And they're trying to be independent. But people very definitely act differently online. My concern is that they're taking that into the real workplace. They're getting so much online time that that's actually becoming their real life persona. And one of the biggest things we found with a new generation of people coming into Dell Corporation was their propensity to share data. They wanted to share data. They needed to be told you're not allowed to share all of that, because a lot of that data is corporate data. It's IP that you're not allowed to share. Yeah, but I want to tell them I'm going to Zurich to this new conference. You can't say that. So go through media, go through et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the issues there. They act differently, and my concern is that they're taking that into real life.
Can I add something to that? So as well, I do believe that linking of an online identity to physical identity plays a role in how people behave. So for example, when we do we had a recent research on 4chan, which is an anonymous sort of platform for people to just claim on everything. And you can clearly see there is a very massive sort of online hate platform there. Then because it's anonymous, everyone feels free to just claim on whatever. And then there is another thing, the community that online identity is associated with is also important. So there has been a recent research on Reddit users that if they are in, let's say, in racist group, they feel that the level of the vocabulary that they use is actually much more tenfolds or something like that to the same user being a normal user on Reddit. So it's actually, I would add to that with these two, the community and the physical sort of linkage of identity plays a massive role in how people behave online. Yeah.
I'll just quickly quote one of my favorite philosophers, Mike Tyson, who said that social media has got people far too comfortable saying stuff without getting punched in the mouth. But I think in all seriousness, I think this is a case of like we look back and we remember the good old days where everything was real. And now we've got this new virtual world where people act different, but the bleed over is very real now. And so we're seeing more elements of that, whereas people were very isolated. This is my online identity, it doesn't impact the real world. But now we see like things like memes and making its way into common vocabulary. And I was in one of the offices the other day, not too long ago, and I heard someone in a meeting go, "Ew, brother, ew, what's that?" And if you're not on TikTok, you probably won't get that reference. But if you are on TikTok, you definitely get the reference as to like it's from a video and what. And you see these things being brought into from the virtual world into the real world. And in some ways it brings people together. It acts as a bridge, but as another way, it can amplify a lot of the negative behaviors as well. So I don't think it's necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just the reality of where people are heading. And so I think we need to meet people where they are and affect change there, as opposed to trying to say, I wish people were offline and we could interact as people, because I don't think we're going to go back to that time again.
If I may, I just want to embellish that and just to say, as cybersecurity people, we very often always try and see the bad things in this. There are really, really good examples of the benefits that have come. There was a person recently who was very, very successful online. He had a lot of community. It gave him confidence. It gave him a sense of being. It gave him a sense of joining. And nobody online realized that he was a quadriplegic, because online he could be whatever he wanted to be. And so that was really good.
Thank you. If it's a very quick one, I think we have time for maybe one more. Oh, there's more hands going up here, but
Let the lady go because we.
Okay,
the
so I have
final
a
question from-
controversial question. Maybe it's not good because it will take too long. So I'm sure the speakers are aware of what's called perceptual hashing. And for those in the audience, this is something that came out of Apple, but then it's used by other people, where they would try to detect on your phone if there's an image of child pornography, and then you'd be reported based on that if it's just found on your phone. You could receive it on your phone because someone had sent you this image and you never requested it, and yet this software on your phone could then report. And this has gone now all the way to the European Union around perceptual hashing and child pornography and security and efficacy and privacy and what we should do about it. So where do you sit on this dilemma?
I think when you take a problem and you give it to an engineer, they'll reframe it as an engineering problem and giving you an engineering solution. And I think this is a problem in cybersecurity. We tend to look at things from a technical lens a lot of the time. So we believe the solution to everything is a technical solution. And I think this is like an example of one of those things that we said, like, oh, there's inappropriate images on people's phones. How do we solve it? And then our first knee-jerk reaction is, let's go to a technical solution. Let's look at hashes. Let's look at this and this. And that could work if the processes were built first behind it as well. Like, what's the process of then approaching that person? How do you get in touch with law enforcement? How do you vet it? Because there's been examples where, like, images like someone had their child had a weird rash on their back or something, and they took a picture of them, and that got flagged as well. So, you know, we need the processes and we need to understand what is the objective, what's the outcome we're going for, rather than jumping head first into a technical solution. I think that's where the challenge occurs.
I'd say exactly, pretty much the same thing. You know, the example of the Metropolitan Police officer, when she was taken to task because there were images on the phone that there was part of a WhatsApp group that she'd never opened, she'd never asked for. And that, I guess, comes from where's the human element in deciding what the process behind it. And it's an example of being a slave to the IT rather than using IT as just a tool and saying, okay, that's raised a flag. Let's investigate it. Okay, I can see where that comes from. That's not an issue. It should be human. And again, that going down the line of, if you make it all automated, if you make it all technical, if you make it all of a machine learning thing, therefore the judge says here machine learning says you're guilty, then that really, we must make sure that there's a human in the loop, putting some sort of sensibility. Of course, the sensibility is subject to their view of ethics and their view of doctrine, but don't let it become dogma.
I would just I can add nothing much to that, except for I thought I would add the trust in the institution as well. So if there is a high judge or judiciary system that generally people don't trust, so it's kind of like, what can we do about it, even if it goes wrong or wrong? So I would just add that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks again to all our speakers. So those that are online, thank you for joining. And those that are here in person, we have refreshments outside, so for some networking. And I know there's a number more questions that are coming up, so we've got the opportunity to carry on the discussion over some thank you all for coming today, and have a good safe journey back when you go.
Oh, you want? You've already taken it.